So as we close off the book of Nehemiah today, I want to begin by reading you a couple of verses from the book of Ecclesiastes. So this is from chapter 3. Verse 1 says, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven." And then in verse 4, "A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." And this is kind of what I want to comment on in what we read in the final three chapters of Nehemiah today. So we read about this amazing celebration that they had when they dedicate the wall of Jerusalem. And then it tells us a bit more of the story of what happened in the future. Nehemiah at some point went back to Shushan, the citadel in the Medo-Persian Empire, where he was serving the king. And then he got leave again from the king to go back, and then he traveled back to Jerusalem. And as we see, Nehemiah still had to deal with more compromise and sin among the people. I mean, it was just ongoing. He went back home to the kingdom. He returns back to Jerusalem, and he finds that these blooming people have backslidden again, and he found them now to be neglecting the service of the temple. They were neglecting the priests. They weren't supporting the priests financially. Many of the priests had left Jerusalem and gone back to their lands and their fields in the surrounding country. And so the service of the temple and the daily sacrifices and that place where any Israelite could go and seek God, that wasn't happening. Not only that, they were profaning the Sabbath. They were doing business on the Sabbath. They were again intermarrying with pagans. So, Nehemiah's like constantly having to deal with the backsliding of these people as he's trying to rebuild the capital city of the nation of Israel and re-establish the worship of God there. And in fact, it was at about this time, the time of Nehemiah, that God sent the final prophet that he would send to Israel. And that was the prophet Malachi. And if you read the book of Malachi, he's rebuking the same sorts of sins that are in Israel. So Malachi speaks against the neglecting of the temple, the neglecting of the priests. They weren't paying their tithes, which they were meant to do. They were not bringing the right animals. They were bringing blind and lame animals to be sacrificed. They were divorcing their wives. So Malachi rebukes them for forsaking the wives of their youth. And he's got the strongest word probably in the whole Bible about divorce there. It says God hates divorce because he desires godly offspring because of the impact that it has on children. So these were the things going on amongst the children of Israel. And yet, in the midst of all of this, when that wall was finished after those 52 days and it was completed and the gates were hung and the whole job was done, we saw in the middle of all this mess an incredible celebration. They knew how to celebrate and thank God when God had done something great amongst them. And this is just another example of Nehemiah's incredible leadership. Good leaders know when to celebrate and when to gather people in celebration. Well, what they've done is they split all the people in Jerusalem into two groups. Ezra the scribe had taken one group that way around the walls, and Nehemiah had taken another group that way around the walls, and then they'd been singing and blowing trumpets, and then they met in the middle, and then they gathered at the temple, and they had this amazing feast. They were sacrificing and singing, and the final verse says, "Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced." So this was a family affair, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. And of course, we remember that verse earlier in Nehemiah where he said, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." And this is the point I want to make today. There is a certain strength that rejoicing in the presence of God gives the Christian. And it is good for us to rejoice at times. And those times are like this when we recognize that God has done something amazing amongst us. God has answered a certain prayer. He has rescued us from a certain situation. He has allowed us to build something great, to achieve something that without His help we wouldn't have achieved, like they had rebuilt the walls. And when it is that we have a moment like that in our lives, it is good for us to gather those who are involved in this thing with us, to gather together and to celebrate and to rejoice and to give God thanks and glory for what He's done. And as I say, I think that has a fortifying influence on the faith of Christians. So let's not miss the seasons for joy and celebration, where we feast together in the sight of God and to the glory of God. So that feasting doesn't involve drunkenness. It involves joy and laughter and feasting, but it's to the glory of God. Get someone to pray. Get someone to tell the story of what happened at that feast that you have. Say grace, thank God, give Him glory, but rejoice and laugh and sing and feast together. And God will use that to give you all courage and strength for the journey ahead. So God bless you, and I'll see you when we pick up in the book of Esther tomorrow.